Hey, were you recording this as a joke?
Yep.
Can we move the camera a little bit over? It's just a little
It's
distracting.
over here.
to
That's
have
just
it.
the microphone.
Yeah,
I can move
no
the
worries.
camera.
It's fine. Don't worry. Cool. Very enjoyable debate, y'all. There were some things I really like, some things I thought could improve, but hopefully both the positive and the suggestion for improvements come through. End up voting for the AF. So let me say first, there's some things the negative strategy focused on that I thought were really strong. I'm sympathetic to focus on praxis, trying to press the AF on questions of how we get from what they're saying in debate to material change or what that means for change outside of debate rounds. And I'm also very sympathetic to the level of complexity in some of the AF theorizing being inaccessible. And, just kind of, even in the debate, there were some parts of the AF speeches where we got real deep into some of the theory, and there were just a couple seconds where my eyes glazed over and I had to dehypnotize. So I you know what I mean? There's some intuitive appeal to that. But I think a couple points of execution made me feel like the AF did better. One place I kind of started thinking a lot was with the alternative. I think you're right to say the negative hasn't dealt with the solvency of the AF in some of the ways that you, or of the alternative in some of the ways that you've indicted the solvency of the AF. But I did think the 2AR did a good job of pointing out that some of the questions the negative had asked about the AF's method, and particularly how that method gets from debate to praxis and becomes operationalized, are questions that I could ask about the alternative too. So kind of one thing that was a little bit unclear to me about the alternative is what am I evaluating it as? Am I evaluating it as a means where we talk about it in debate, and then debate is a vehicle through which we can externalize spirituality? Or is it just sort of, it's not about the jump from debate to outside world, it's about a method, and then we can kind of use that method outside. So, I'm just voting, is the method good, bad, or am I voting the relationship between debate and enactment of that method was a little bit unclear. Are we like training debaters to proselytize, or what? I don't know. I wasn't clear what to do with that. And that also became important for me in the permutation as well. One thing, one trap I thought the negative fell into on the permutation that I see with some frequency is utilizing the link a little bit incorrectly. So don't get me wrong, the link is super important to answering a permutation, and definitely your answers to the permutation should focus around the link. I felt a little bit like the negative approached it as if, well, all we have to do is win a link and then we're good. The better way to do that is to say the permutation links, and here's what that means for including the AF with the strategy of spirituality. Here's how, either trade-off arguments or disruption arguments, but I think walking through, using the links to walk through the process of attempting to combine both methods, and using the links to illustrate why the inclusion of the AF is disruptive. And I think part of that too comes from just a general orientation in the debate that was a little bit too defensive. There were some offensive parts, so I don't mean to say that those weren't there and not recognize those. There's definitely components of the 2NR where you talked about psychic death and resentiment arguments, but it is a little shallow for me. I wish that had been more of the focus in both 2NR and 2NC, and I think those are the arguments then that become really useful on the permutation to say our links prove that the resentiment and psychic death created by the affirmative then are disruptive to adoption of spirituality and generation of psychic life because yada, 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 yada. I think that's a little bit more stronger. Yes. So then I kind of went and evaluated some of the defensive claims, but it was sort of feeling like we maybe had to get to the level of presumption with which the negative had talked about, and I'd struggle with that a bit. I do think, you won a lot of defense, and like I said, I thought some of your defensive focus was good. The DAF did have some good moments of creating potential for productivity, like indicting an absolute barrier between theory and practice, developing the connection between discourse and action, I did think that was grounded out with some examples. I guess one thing for the F is I think that would have been stronger. I felt like at times there's a little disconnect between 1AR and 2AR in terms of what are the examples that are used. I thought the 1AR example of George Jackson, writings in prison, and then what, but then that wasn't really part of 2AR, but then there's some other interesting examples in 2AR. So there were times in this debate where I felt like you all just could be a little bit on the same page and have some consistency in between, yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question
Sure.
about the examples thing?
Yeah.
One thing I get kind of worried about with like examples and stuff is that I kind of get worried, I guess, like more so in these debates especially, that it kind of gets to the point of like the dead horse, you know what I mean? It's like 2AC George Jackson, 1AR George Jackson, then 2AR just George Jackson. It's kind of like, I mean, I think there's room for development within that, but I mean, like, should I keep that and then say that that is like similar to other examples, like, and then give the stuff I was saying in the 2AR?
When you say beating a dead horse, do you mean like when you keep providing different examples, it's beating a dead horse, or we just talk about the same example, it's beating a dead horse?
When I keep giving the same example,
yeah.
And so should I just be like, but this is similar to these other ones, like, and then go off on my own tangents?
I guess I think it's better to keep consistency with examples, but maybe expound on the explanation a little bit more. You know what I mean? So I think if we keep jumping around for examples, so two things. One is I don't think it has to be beating a dead horse. I think there's room enough, and these issues are complicated enough, that the explanation can expand in 2AC, 1AR, and 2AR. And then I think it's good to keep the same example, just to have some consistency, to make sure those examples are talked through. I think one of the, sure, yeah, I mean, it's helpful to be able to have that. But also I just think, one thing I think the negative is correct about is like, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on in a very limited amount of time in a debate speech. So I guess I wouldn't feel like we had already exhausted the George Jackson debate in the 1AR. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot to be said there. How does that compare to the alternative? How does that compare to the AF? How does it fit in? How do we fit it into these larger strategies? So I think there's more you can do, and that it's better for 1AR and 2AR to be on the same page of those sorts of things. So based on that, I think I felt comfortable saying there are ways in which the AF could be productive that make inclusion of it, especially combined with the permutation, some of the arguments about sociogeny that made me most comfortable including the AF, because I think there are ways in which the AF could be useful. I guess another issue I had on making an absolute defensive claim for the negative was that some of the arguments the negative advance I struggled with in really trying to figure out how much I should do with it, and that they required some kind of tricky threshold questions that are tough to resolve as a judge. So some of these arguments were like, the F includes some issues but doesn't include Octavia Butler, or talks about it not in 1AC but in 2AC, or talks about the Messiah but doesn't have it enough. In order to judge those claims, it's tough because I wish the negative had provided a metric for sufficiency. Like, when do we look at what the AF has done and been like, this is embodied or not? So that makes it sort of hard to tell. Or maybe the negative's making a claim that the threshold doesn't matter because anything that we do in academia or ivory tower. But if that's the case, then why bring up threshold questions like you didn't talk about it enough, or you didn't highlight this one thing? It's hard. Okay, those are main things. I had a couple things that were either just a little bit more meta or not in the debate, I want to say, but questions about things that were in the debate first.
Well, I guess one thing we were struggling with was we wanted to make the app doesn't include stuff offense, and sort of make it what the alt was as opposed to what the app was. So sort of the alt is placing the app in a particular context, if that makes sense. So all of our embodiment type arguments, which are all of our, I kept saying embodiment, which is an issue, but all of our arguments about excluding the experiences of particular populations, we were sort of trying to be that's something that's accomplished better by the alt as opposed to the app.
Interesting.
Yeah,
sort of I don't think I got that.
Yeah. Okay.
How does the alt do that?
Just because spirituality gives context and sort of is a way of linking resistance to Western man with the South, and sort of the
This is one thing I was going to say too, but that wasn't really brought up in the debate too. But even just kind of now, it feels that sometimes when you frame alternative as a means of resistance to Western man, that there's a little bit of tension there, if I'm understanding correctly, with the Grand Prix and Love evidence.
Yeah.
So it wasn't anything in this debate, but at the top of the 2NR, you kind of made an argument about, and one thing that AF does is resist oppression, and then kind of so it's possible there's a nuance there I'm not getting, but at least on a immediate level, and maybe that was something that AF could kind of explain a little bit too. It seemed like they were talking about resistance to oppression bad as opposed to institution building, and then they said they saw resistance to oppression bad. So sorry, one thing I want to say. Places the concept. So I think I understand on generally spirituality as a means of building people up, creating psychic energy. I'm still not sure I'm 100% on ways in which it's sort of inclusive of the AF as a means to create context of the AF. I don't know. Maybe it just requires more explanation.
Yeah. So do you think we should just go less for these arguments about the presumption type arguments?
What? Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Do you win a lot of debates on presumption?
No.
Okay.
This is the third debate we've had this year.
Okay. So I just think as an approach, it happens, but it's unlikely. So I think I just would instead have a little bit more balance. I think the blocks to make it more offensive were there. The ressentiment and psychic death argument, sort of the flip side of what the alternative builds up. I think those were there. It just seemed like those were treated as a cursory part of the strategy. And I think if it was more balanced between, not presumption, but we're going to take out your absolvency, and we got a DA, and we got an alt too. You know what I mean? If there's just kind of more, each of those three components is important. And I think if there's more balance between those components, that this is a very strong strategy.
Okay.
One more suggestion I was thinking about for ideas for the AF is, I think you can do more with some of the ways the negative is speaking about kind of external communities. And I think there's even an offensive argument to be made about the way that the negative treats oppressed communities out there. It is a problem, potentially condescending. Because it's
I was going to try to get to them too.
The year 2 high theory for them.
Right, yeah. So it's what do we know about those communities based on this debate?
It's you have to
we know they don't like waking up in the morning, and we know that, you know what I mean, that's difficult for them to understand complicated shit. Well, that's
Yeah. We were going to make that argument in conjunction with the authenticity testing thing, but it just didn't with time and stuff. Basically.
Yeah, there's a couple times John and Needy have these debates against Rutgers where they made similar kind of arguments. It just seems there's a component of it I think that could be turned into offense. It seems like we're being a little paternalizing, we're being a little condescending to outside communities. Not that I'm not sympathetic with the idea that Whaley and some other ideas are maybe I can maybe be convinced that that's too complicated for anybody, but you know what I mean. I think it does feel like there's a claim you can be made that we're treating these communities with disrespect when we underestimate their capabilities for understanding things that are complicated. And then just kind of only other thing I had for AF is I think in some ways for you all your strength is connected to your weakness. I think your all strength is clearly you have a very deep understanding of your arguments, and your explanations and discussions are very impressive and persuasive, and you do a good job connecting it to negative arguments. But I think it's also the biggest danger sometimes in that you sort of fall in love with explaining your shit, and we get a little bit disconnected from the actual debating. Some of my folks had that issue too, but even just kind of the approach of the 2 hour, it's just kind of a big mess. I think this is one of those things as a judge where because you're external, it doesn't seem quite as complicated, I think, as it does when you're a debater and you're in it. So I didn't totally understand for 2NR and 2 everyone's oh my god, it's a mess. So we're a little all over the place on the flow, but I think as a judge, you're well, really, there's 2 or 3 issues. You know what I mean? There's what does this do? What is the alter? How do we compare the alternative? There's 3 things, and so I think you can kind of take that position of the judge and be like, all right, maybe the flow's a little bit messy, but let's hear the three things we're really talking about. Does what we're talking about actually do anything? Can this be useful? Is this, is this connected to praxis, or does it, we're getting rid of practice? So, what does the alternative do? So it's that I think you can create focus and structure yourself, even if that focus and structure hasn't naturally emerged from the debate. And so I guess I would encourage that. So keep the good in-depth explanation of the AF, but make sure we're always thinking about it in terms of what are the issues the judge is going to be deciding, and how do we directly apply it to those calculations where the judge is like, alts or AF, good or bad for, that kind of stuff. Okay, and anything else I can be helpful with?
I think we're good.
Cool.
Thanks.
Enjoyed watching y'all. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.